In the early 1800s, late one evening, a well-dressed gentleman entered the Castle pub of London's Hockley-in-the-Hole gaming district, claiming to be a royal courtier. His master, he explained, had lost more money than he had on hand at the nearby cockpit. Would the owner, he wondered, provide his master a quick loan to pay the losses? The strange request would have been uncommon, but only in specifics to the owner, who had surely heard every variety of crooked story, as well as those of fast fortunes and fast company, as a business operator in the notorious gaming district Hockley-in-the-Hole that was home to the cockpit, the Castle pub, and other games of chance, prize fights, and theatrical acts, street performers, princes, thieves, scholars, scamps. So your lordship needs some cash over at the cockfight, and he can pay it all back tomorrow. Sorry, good sir, I'm not in the habit of handing money out to every sad story that comes across the bar. At the pub owner's hesitation, though, the gentleman offered a pocket watch as collateral, a nice piece that would more than cover the loan. The only problem with this was that it made the deal a crime, since pawnbrokers required a license from the crown, and were never, as a rule, issued to pubs. In the end, though, the offer was more than fair at face value for the pub owner, given the pricey watch, so he proffered the loan and took the watch, apparently unaware or unbelieving of the identity of the cockpit borrower. To his surprise, the next day, a royal messenger arrived at the pub to pay the debt and collect the piece. The messenger also presented the pub with a pawnbroker's license and insignia, all courtesy of the borrower, King George IV. As the story goes, the license has been reissued annually by the government ever since, and the Castle pub, still existent, is the only one in England with a pawnbroker's license. You're listening to Bloodline. Number 4, Royal Pastime, Rabble Darling, Part 2. The story of King George IV is from the pub itself, as told by a few different websites. I didn't bend over backwards to verify it, in this case taking Mark Twain's practical advice of not letting the truth get in the way of a good story. But there's no reason to think it's not true. The pub does have the brass orbs of a licensed pawnbroker. It's located in the old gaming district, and King George was a regular attendee of the cockfights and apparently the club. Additionally, Sport in Olden Time, written in the early 20th century by British agricultural historian Sir Walter Gilby, tells of a similar incident with King George IV and the Duke of York, so there's good evidence to suggest part or all of that story is true. At the end of the last episode, we had explored cocking in England through the 1600s, and I had mentioned that the 18th and early 19th centuries, up to the rule of King George IV, was a boom period for cocking in Great Britain. But it's not likely that this came in the form of further public acceptance at home, though the British gamecock, various families of battle crosses or match cocks obtained through trial and error, more careful selection of traits, and weighing 4 to 6 pounds in range, became famous the world over as the most dominant fighting cocks on the planet. As far as adoption at home, however, the sport almost certainly was nearing a saturation point among the English. There were cockpits in every part of the island and most parts of the kingdom, including Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, and the sport accommodated the poor as readily as the wealthy as one of the primary forms of entertainment. It had been adored by the clergy and crown and every person in between. For at least the previous 500 years, the country had institutionalized cockfights among schoolboys annually during the Shrovetide tradition, celebrating the valor, bravery, and fine qualities of the fighting cocks. Considering all that, the participation numbers wouldn't have had much room to grow. Instead, the period of the 1700s is characterized by the sport's transformation towards more structure, organization, and fair play that begin to resemble a modern cockfight, and was an early forerunner of modern team sports, thanks to subscription mains, gave us the earliest forms of sports journalism, with regular reporting in the racing journals and newspapers, and was among the first gaming and entertainment economies formed in the pre-modern era of civilization, with the rise of professional competitors and wage-earning jobs to support it. In this episode, we'll explore British cockfighting and gamefowl landscape of the 18th century, examining some of the earliest adopted rules for the sport, and look at the lives and impact to the game from some of the most famous cockfighters and gamefowl breeders of the period. Within a 10-year period around 1700, cockfights in England adopted artificial spurs and also began using scales to match roosters to weight. The previous system relied on eyeball and hand measurements and was thus an unpredictable variable in the fight. Similarly, artificial spurs standardized the weapons of the fight while reducing the amount of injury to both the winning and losing birds by hastening the fight. In short, both the application of scales and of artificial spurs aimed to put both cocks on the same playing field at the outset of the fight. A fair fight was appealing to gamblers, but it had the down chain effect of boosting competition, resulting in higher standard of fowl, adding legitimacy to the contest and improving the overall demeanor of competitors, as well as resulting in decreased agitation among spectators. Just keep in mind as we go through this episode that there was a lot going on in England and the world in the 1700s. It was a different time. The British economy was booming, as was its population. It doubled during the century as well as the century before. And for most of the 18th century, work was done by beasts or by man. Machines wouldn't begin to step in until the latter half of the 18th century, when England was at the heart of the Industrial Revolution. There was no radio or television. Pandemic episodes of the plague rolled through over decades. You may recall from the last episode that most of London burned to the ground over the course of a week in the late 1600s. Fires, famine, plague, and war were never far from reality. Amidst all this, cockfights, as well as other forms of entertainment like horse racing, prize fighting, and the theater, sometimes resulted in brawls or riots or other violence. When this happened, the proprietors often risked losing their business licenses. Facing this risk, we are given the earliest versions of rule books for cockfighting, as well as horse racing. The formation of these rules came strictly out of necessity to protect business interests and predate modern team sporting events. The first known published rules, which I'll call the first 19, were published in the Racing Calendar in 1747. A complete list of these rules is available on the website at bloodlinepodcast.com. Several of the rules deal with spectator conduct specifically, dispute resolution among spectators, and penalties for dishonest betting practices, all of which are off topic to a rule set about cockfighting and might better fit under the heading of house rules. But again, these rules were the result of business owners trying to protect their butts by keeping everyone on their best behavior. Later versions of the rules, which we'll also look at, are more specifically directed to the cockfight itself. Counterintuitively, the later rule sets, which focus more specifically on what's going on in the cockpit, had the desired effect of the early rules because they increased fair play and order in the cockfight itself, resulting in less agitation among spectators. Though preoccupied with governing spectator conduct, the first 19 still contain some of the seeds of the modern cockfight. Let's take a look. The first rule stipulates cocks must be fought in good feather and not be overly trimmed, something you'll see in most, if not all, modern rulebooks. They also outline an early scoring system, wherein a losing rooster could be counted out and included a 20 count and multiple 10 counts. What we call the count, they referred to as the law in these early rulebooks. A rooster not showing fight was given 10 10-second counts, if I understand that correctly. When both cocks stopped fighting, and neither rooster had the count, a hobbled rooster was brought in from the outside and shown to the combatants one at a time. If only one showed fight against the outside rooster, it was the winner. If both showed signs of fight, or neither showed, the fight was a draw. If at any point during the fight there is a 40-to-1 bet, 10 pounds to 5 shillings offered on the fight and no one calls it, the odds-favored rooster would be declared a winner. Also in these rules, the master of the pit, what we may call the referee, is given the authority to settle disputes among participants as well as spectators. If both parties involved in a dispute request it, 4 to 6 of the most experienced gamesters could be used to assist in the decision. In the event a bet required mediation, each party was to put his wager down plus 6 pence. After each side was heard and the judgment was made, the bet was paid plus the 6 pence to the recipient. Continuing to complain or even speak of the dispute after judgment was made was punishable by a fine. My favorite rule deals with the practice of basketing, which was the name for the punishment given to someone who was unable to pay a lost wager. If no credit could be secured nor an agreement reached, the offending gambler would be placed in a basket provided for such a purpose and raised by a pulley in some conspicuous location visible to everyone for the remainder of the day's fights. At the Royal Cockpit at Newmarket, the basket was over the pit. A painting of this, which you can see at bloodlinepodcast.com, by William Hogarth, includes a silhouette of an occupied basket casting its shadow on the pit floor, indicating that this was more than just a mere threat. By the late 18th century, an updated version of the first 19 had been formed and was published in 1808. These began with an instruction that allowed participants of the main to inspect their opponent's cockhouse prior to weigh-in to ensure no ringers were planted in the stalls. There are detailed instructions for weighing and matching cocks, as well as inspection of the birds by an official prior to each fight. Instructions are given for when and how the handlers can interfere with the fight after it begins. A counting system for scoring matches is again described and closer resembles a predecessor to those seen in the McCall and Wortham rules that were popular in the U.S. prior to Prohibition. The previous technical victory was still available should anyone offer 40-to-1 odds and get no takers. The odds-favored cock was again the winner. Some specifics for this were drawn up in later versions of the rules. The man placing the bet must put down his hat or cane or some other personal item to act as surety on the cockpit floor, and the referee would announce the bet 3 times. Will no one call it? To call the bet, another person would be required to do the same, tossing his own hat into the ring to claim the wager. These later rules stipulate that neither the count-out process or the long odds rule could supersede a clear winner, where a cock had clearly killed its opponent. A single rule about wagers had won out by this time. All disputes regarding bets were to be settled among spectators and paid according to the pit judge's decision under penalty of law. Both the adoption of rules and the formation of subscription mains, where localized teams of cockers would pool resources to compete against neighboring groups, as well as the adoption of professional competitors, had the result of increasing the volume and degree of competitiveness of cocking on the island. These factors combined with the adoption of artificial spurs to give rise to professional ranks of competitors, as well as craftsmen to supply them in the 1700s. The demand for artificial spurs was enough to create a niche trade for gaff makers to supply the cockers with reliable, sharp, well-built gaffs. London's Cockspur Street was given its name for the gaff makers who set up shop there. It was home to well-known gaff makers such as Clay, Smith, Falman, Garfield, and others. Subscription mains gained traction, opening up large events and bigger prizes to individuals who alone may not have had the money to make a multi-day main practical, but groups from the same town may pool their roosters and money and challenge a neighboring group, opening mains as an option to more cockers. The larger purses available, very real bragging rights, and the logistical challenge of gathering and selecting among multiple chicken yards the best cocks for the main, which would then need to be transported to the pit and fed, put through a pre-fight routine, made subscription events frequent clients of the professional feeder and other professional cockers, and increased the number and frequency of large cocking events previously reserved for the wealthy. The number of cockpits increased, and more cockpits resulted in more cockfighting, or maybe it is the latter that causes the former. In this case, it doesn't matter if the chicken came before the egg, just that more cockfights were taking place in more cockpits. The period of growth toward a modern version of cockfighting was nearly identical to what the world of horse racing was doing at the same time. Like cockfighting, the racetrack economy increased demand for professional competitors, specifically jockeys, owners, and trainers. Horse racing and cockfighting in England had their fortunes yoked at least from the 16th century to the start of the 19th century. Both were tremendously popular attractions that intermingled the social classes by providing wagers and contests to the poor as readily as the wealthy. The country's largest races and their corresponding cockfight were planned with consideration to one another. Racing was done during one part of the day and cockfights another. The two wager-driven competitions began to professionalize their ranks around the same period in the early 1700s, both also trying their hand at standardizing rules to improve fairness, and both struggling to find ways to maintain order at events. They entered the 19th century side by side with as much popular support as they had ever enjoyed. Both zeroed in on standardized rules suitable to their new modern identities and professional wage earners. For cockfighting, these newer rules detailed the progression of the contests, which were effective in suiting the needs of the cockfighters, pit owners, and other vested interests, while also curbing disagreement and unrest without much mention of spectator conduct. From William Sketchley's 1814 publication, The Cocker, we learn what advancements had been made in the standards of care, breeding, and even which bloodlines were most in demand. Among the bloodlines that were popular by the early 19th century were black reds, piles, silver black-breasted ducks or duck wings, birchen ducks, dark grays, mealy grays, blacks, spangles, furnaces, polecats, cuckoos, gingers, and duns. Of the list, the piles, a family established by Charles II, were noted cutters, with the lighter-colored family being especially effective strikers. To provide some idea of how the population felt about cocking, consider how the sport was treated by the kings who didn't participate in it. Henry VIII is thought to have built the royal cockpit with adjoining lodgings at Westminster as part of Whitehall Palace sometime after 1509. And while Henry VIII's surviving daily accounts detail his affinity for gambling, there is no mention of any spending, winning, or losses at the cockpit, which suggests he wasn't a cocker, but included the building for the enjoyment of others in his court. George II and George III reigned for just over 90 years, 1727 through 1820, and neither appear to have taken personal interest in gamefowl, but both owned fowl which were tended by the king's master of gamecock. George II appointed the foremost feeder of the period, Joseph Gilliver, to the position, and George III employed his son, William Gilliver. As the master of gamecocks, the Gillivers were responsible for feeding and fighting the king's roosters in the royal cockpit. Like Henry VIII's construction of a royal cockpit at Westminster, this appears to have been a gesture by the sovereigns to acknowledge the passion of the people. For more insight into the life in England and attitudes towards gamefowl at the outset of the 18th century, I refer to the Royal Pastime, a book published in 1709. It was written by Robert Hallett and dedicated to his benefactor, Sir T.V. Knight. Sir T.V., we learn in the dedication, is from a family of cockers. His grandfather, we are told, lay there bleeding and dying, was thus, like a good subject, heard to say, My king and a good cock I have ever loved, and like a good cock in my dread sovereign's service I shall now expire. His father and uncles passed the trade to him early on, and he pursued it passionately until he left for war, where he fought for King William III in the bloody Irish fields of Athlone and Connaught against the French as part of the 9 Years' War. He then returned home across the Atlantic in midwinter to rejoin his friends, tenants, and neighbors at his manor house for Christmas. The following spring, Sir T.V. returned to fighting, eventually winding up at the siege of Namur, considered William's most significant military win of the war, but at some point in the battle, Sir T.V. suffered an injury that would cost him a limb, presumably a leg, though Hallett tells us that he was unencumbered by it in the moment, yet limping still fought on, and charged as unconcerned as if you had no wound upon you, until his majesty was pleased to give particular orders to have you brought off. After he had lost the leg, and recovered from the injury, Sir T.V. joined King William at The Hague, laid down his arms, and kissed the king's hand. I offer this to show that even for the wealthiest classes, combat was often brutal and fought in open fields or in siege of walled cities, and when called to do so, young men were expected to enter into such bloodbaths without hesitation or regard to danger or injury, and continue straight to either victory or death unless ordered to do otherwise. Sir T.V.'s disregard in battle for his injury exemplifies the desired behavior of the annual Shrovetide cockfights in grammar schools of the time. The picture painted is a lord who extends a generous and gentle hand to the people in his care, his tenants, neighbors, the poor, but who is without regard or reason in battle. The opening lines from the Royal Pastime illustrate the esteem for cocking held by its British practitioners at the outset of that century. Hallett writes, Amongst all the pleasures and delights this lower sphere affords to mortals here on earth, there is nothing more taking with the heroic and truly generous soul than the noble and most princely pastime of cockfighting, which really is in itself a recreation becoming the greatest potentate. most suitable to all such whose natural genius prompts them on to finalize their valor in the field of honor, where, like the cock fitted for battle with their bright arms, they move their fortune and so raise themselves to the highest pitch of glory. Beyond reverence for the sport itself, Hallett's prose illustrates a deep admiration for gamecocks by cockers of the time, who wrote extensive lines of verse dedicated to the fowl and the beneficial effects they had on man, many of which are preserved, from the royal Pastime, quoting a poem of the time. And some more martial are, but cocking fits a man for peace or war. It makes men bold and forward for the field, and learns them there rather to die than yield. Cocking does also constancy create, and arms a man to wrestle with his fate. Be it more happy or severe, his mind is still the same to a brave end inclined. By George II's ascension in 1722, cockfighting reports and advertisements filed regularly in the London papers, as well as the annual racing calendar. These reports took up as much space in the London papers as the annual High Crimes Tribunal, the Assize trials, as well as the royal birthday announcements. The cockpit was a regular stop for most foreign dignitary caravans, and during Grand Duke Nicholas's 1817 visit to the island, he attended a main with the Russian ambassador, Duke of Devonshire, and Sir William Congreve, as well as General Kutuzov, where the group spent an hour and a half watching 5 cockfights. Event advertisements or public notices were common for pits at Bridgenorth, Stoke, Worcester, Wellington, Dudley, and Lichfield, all of which were within a day's journey of Birmingham in the south. Further north, big mains were common at Duddleston Hall and the site of the Preston racetrack. The sport was so popular as to give several London roads their names, some of which still exist today. A 1761 map of London lists 10 locations named Cock Alley. There were 9 cock courts and 8 cock yards, 4 cock lanes, in addition to Cock Hill, Cockpit Alley, Cockpit Buildings, Cockpit Street, Court, and Yard, as well as Cock's Rent. In the next episode, we'll get to know some of the colorful and influential people involved in cockfighting in England during this period. If you're a visual learner or just want to read more on these topics, I encourage everyone to visit the website at bloodlinepodcast.com, where you'll find a bibliography of the texts I've consulted, photos to accompany each episode, and links to outside sites for further reading. You can also join the discussion at the Bloodline Podcast Facebook group. Just search for Bloodline Podcast under the Groups tab on Facebook. I'd also like to thank everyone so far for their encouragement in this project. We've had members of the community from all over the world sharing episodes with their friends and giving feedback to me, proving just how universal the universal sport is. So to all of our friends in sport, thanks, keep sharing, and keep listening. Bloodline Podcast is made by me, Jesse Sidlauskas. Music for this episode is Lobo Loco, You Get the Blues. Until next time, y'all keep them growing.